The longer I spend on these quests for achievement and advancement, the more I wish to have never begun them at all. I can think of no worse end to an undertaking than to regret its conception, and for me there is no better measure for saying Dark Souls 2 is the worst game I've ever played. This is a quote from Michael Thompson in a so-called infamous review of Dark Souls 2. Published in Forbes magazine. Frank Lantz, another author, believes that this paragraph is perhaps one of the most powerful examples that we have of someone engaging with games as an aesthetic medium. And it's with this quote that Professor Frank Lantz opens one of the chapters in his book, Beauty of Games. I recently had the opportunity to read through this book, and in this video, I'm going to tell you my thoughts. We're going to break down just what Lantz means by an aesthetic medium, do our best at unpacking his so-called grand unified theory of games, and hopefully determine whether or not Dark Souls 2 is really the worst game that our dear friend Michael has ever played. But first, I want to thank MIT Press for helping to sponsor this video and providing me with a review copy of The Beauty of Games so that I could share my review with you today. If you'd like to help support the channel, hit the like button or the subscribe button. That does a lot. It really does a lot to helping a small channel like mine. I'd really appreciate it. Thank you. So, aesthetic medium. What does that mean? Well, put simply, aesthetics is just the appreciation of beauty. Lantz cites soap operas, stand-up comedy, and rock music as all examples of aesthetic media. Basically, it's something you enjoy for its own sake. And Lantz has chosen this word aesthetics specifically because it circumvents a lot of the baggage that comes with the word art. People basically get a little emotional about whether or not you're going to label something as art or not, and Lantz believes that by using this label of aesthetic instead of artistic, that we can skip that argument and just get to the meat of what implications such as an aesthetic medium could have. So I think this is pretty smart rhetoric on Lantz's part to circumvent that argument, to focus on what he wants to talk about, but I just couldn't resist it, so I want to tell you a little bit about what defines an artistic medium for me, and ultimately getting at whether or not I think games as a medium are an artistic medium. Okay, so personally, I'm kind of tired of this argument about whether or not something is labeled as art. I've read way too many articles on the subject, and it seems that they far too often boil down to this idea that, well, anything can be art if you look at it that way. To the point that art as a label, it becomes almost meaningless, which I don't think makes for a very good definition. Now, whether or not something is art is, I think, definitely subjective, just like I think beauty is a subjective label. And so therefore, I think that any definition we come up with needs to adequately capture that subjectivity. It needs to be a subjective definition in order to be, I think, an accurate definition. And one that has kind of resonated with me is this idea that it's art depending on whether or not the artist was trying to make art. That allows us to rely on the intentionalism behind the work to define its purpose. And that's a very traditionalist approach. However, I think more and more people these days are trying to think about a work of art separated from the artist. Sometimes this lens is called death of the author, where we might imagine if the author wasn't here to tell us what their intention was, what can we glean from just the work itself? And so there are definitely issues with that frame of reference as well, but I think it's useful as a counterpoint, and it's ultimately why I don't really like that definition of art. And instead, there's a very different definition that's resonated more with me over the last few years that I think I came upon when I was reading a review for, or it was maybe like a preface to this comic called The Swamp Thing. And what that author was talking about, what this critic was talking about, is he's saying that it's really the breadth of criticism around a medium that defines the artistic merit of the medium. And I think that is just a really good way to look at it. I think it's a really good way to define whether or not something really is an artistic medium. So, for example, if you've got a medium like, let's say, books, and there's a ton of book reviewers, and let's say maybe people will read reviews of books before they even try them, to the degree that you might even have a review of a book printed on the book. I've seen that before. And other times there's people who even compile lists of books that they recommend for you. Well, I'd say that's a very healthy breadth of criticism surrounding this medium of book writing. And so for that reason, I think it helps define books as a very artistic endeavor, a very artistic medium. On the other hand, if you take a product like, let's say, toothpaste, there are not a lot of toothpaste reviewers, right? People, I think, very rarely will look up reviews of different toothpaste brands before they choose to use a given toothpaste product. And I mean, to my knowledge, there probably isn't like a lot of lists online where they might recommend you, different kinds of toothpastes. So I would say that like toothpaste is probably is a much less artistic medium, or at least like less rigorously artistic as an artistic endeavor, I guess, if you're going to go off and create toothpaste. Now, that's not to say that can't change, right? Because at any point, somebody can change the game in the toothpaste world and start creating these toothpaste that people do talk about and they do write reviews of. And that can birth a breadth of criticism that I think can lend artistic merit to the medium. But I don't think that's the case right now. And so what I love about the subjectivity of that definition is it does provide the ability for a medium, whether it's toothpaste or books or anything really, to become, more and more artistic. It does give you that level of, let's say, it's not discretized, right? It's not saying, oh, it's art or not. It's saying, yeah, there's definitely some degrees to it. And so I think that definition is a lot more subjective. It's a lot more malleable, and it's probably more accurate than one that relies solely on the intentionalism of the author. So this criticism aspect is actually something that Lantz talks a little bit about. He mentions that he's noticed that the reviews of video games have moved in newspapers from the technology section to the art and media section to be alongside reviews of things like movies or TV shows. And so I think Lantz might have been very close to aligning with something like my definition there, but he ultimately veers in a very different direction because he really sticks to this idea that the definition of aesthetics really just boils down to whether or not you're participating in something, just for the sake of participating in it, right? This idea of art for the sake of art. But then he plays a little bit of devil's advocate, and he says, what about a game like poker? So after all, in the game poker, you do earn money. And if that's the case, does that mean that these games like poker are no longer an aesthetic experience since you've got money as a sort of outside motivation for why you might engage with them? And Lantz, ultimately to this criticism, says, nah, not really. When you fully engage with poker, you completely forget about the money. And money literally transforms, right, into these poker chips. And so now there's sort of an abstraction there, and he believes that to be truly something different. He says, if you just focus on greed, you're not going to get the full experience of poker, right? You're going to get lost in the sauce of everything that the outside world brings into that experience. And you're starting to think about the mechanics versus the aesthetics. And so in that sense, you're not thinking about the true aesthetic medium of poker, right? So that's his argument. This reminds me a little bit of an interview with this famous poker player named Daniel Negreanu, who I believe is maybe like one of the champions of poker. I'm sure he's won the World Series of Poker or whatever it is at some point or another. And he was talking about how at the highest echelons of poker, right, at the highest stakes that you could play, these World Poker Series tournaments, people sometimes have to make a very difficult decision of whether or not they're going to play sort of one of two games. And there's this idea that you can play an idealized version of poker where you forget about the money. You really just focus on the game. You're just focused on winning, trying to get the first place position. But there is a very compelling second game at the same time, where I might call this, instead of the idealized poker, you might call this real world poker, where you do care about the prize pool. You do care about the money. And he says that there's a certain situation that will happen where, let's say you're in a tournament where the prize pool is for the first, second, and third place seats. So the way that these poker tournaments work are you sort of get knocked out until you're the last person standing. Maybe in terms of games, it's a battle royale-like experience, okay? And so they may have given you, maybe it's $1 million for the first place, $500,000 for second place, and then third place, they get $250,000. Well, then if you're in fourth place, right? Because if you're currently in fourth place, which is to say that there are 4 people left in the tournament, then if you were to lose now, you'd get nothing. So ultimately, you just need to make sure that somebody else loses before you. And that will at least guarantee you the third place position because you'll be one of the last 3. And then you'll at least get the $250,000 payout. So what Negreanu says there is there's a lot of pressure to sort of play safe. You want to play a little bit safe. You don't want to risk it all because it's better to guarantee yourself $250,000 to walk home with that money than it is just try and risk it all in a sort of wild pursuit to try and get the first place position. And so there's a sort of battle there between the idealized version and the real world version of poker, sort of combating against each other. So at least this is how I've interpreted this discussion that Lantz has proposed here. And ultimately, I think that Lantz's argument is not very compelling. At least, in perspective of hearing what actual poker players like Daniel Negreanu think about this experience. Because in my interpretation, it really sounds like we're backsliding here into that, intentionalism definition, where previously I was talking about how, you could think about whether or not poker is artistic based on the creator of poker. What was his goal, right? But here again, we're thinking, and again, I think it's a bit of a vapid argument. Here, we're saying, oh, okay, poker is artistic whether or not the players of poker think it's an artistic medium. Whether or not, to Lantz's point, they're engaging in this truly idealized aesthetic medium. And I just think that's kind of silly because, take a game like, Call of Duty. You could be playing Call of Duty just with your buddies, just for fun, or you could be playing Call of Duty with $1 million on the line, trying to compete in one of these big tournaments, right? Does one playthrough versus the other playthrough mean that the medium itself is more or less artistic? Or are we just, judging whether or not something is artistic or, let's say, aesthetic based on our single play through experience, right? Is it just, I sit down one day, it's an aesthetic medium. I sit down another day, now it's no longer aesthetic, right? It's just way too subjective to the point that it's a little bit silly, right? So I think this definition definitely needs to be one that's subjective. I think the definition I propose with respect to the criticism, it's not my original idea. Someone else had come up with it. I don't remember his name, but I think that is way more is more precise. And I think here, I think Lantz's definition is a little bit too loose to the sake that it sort of gets at that point of like, okay, everything is art, because anything can kind of be engaged with in this aesthetic point of view where you're sort of mind melding with the experience. So yeah, I don't necessarily agree with what Lantz is saying here, though I appreciate his argument, and he's fairly consistent in this book. Which, when it comes to his perspective, he proceeds to talk about the game of poker and how it relates to the game of Go in what I think is a very strange manner. So he identifies Go as an austere, mystical, a beloved icon of game design snobs, whereas poker is a tacky American pop culture junk food sleaze buffet. Go is a game for refined scholars, and poker is a game for cowboys and nerds, stockbrokers and frat boys. To which I would respond, what? What are you talking about? So maybe this is a bit of a generational divide, but I totally lost the author when it came to this description of these two games. It seriously feels like Lantz is just picking on poker because of the betting aspect, which is to say the monetary aspect, which is to say the non-aesthetic aspect of the game. But I really don't think that's a fair depiction of these two games, and I certainly don't think that they are polar opposites. I think that's absurd. Sure, Go is a game where you're thinking very deeply, but poker is also a game where you're thinking very deeply. And I think the more that you dive into modern poker theory, the more that you'll discover that. Because, at the highest echelons of poker play, you're not even representing the cards in front of you, right? You're representing a range of hands. And so, the pro poker players are fighting against not, my cards versus your cards, but the entire possibility space of cards that I could represent judged against your entire possibility space of the cards that you have. And furthermore, Go is a solved game, right? Solved meaning that there is an optimal solution, right? So in a game of tic-tac-toe, right, a computer will basically always beat you in tic-tac-toe or tie with you. It's solved. And Go, at least in a 5x5 board, is currently, like, as in today, it's a solved game. And the broader boards, I'm sure, are going to be solved as well, because it's the same game, right? You just need more computational power, which we don't have access to right now. Whereas poker will never be a solved game. Poker will never be a solved game because of that human element. Even if you know the exact win percentages of every single hand of poker, playing optimally, right, which is to say at like a computer, based on that win percentage ratio, is never going to be the optimal way, the truly optimal way to play poker, because it's not taking into consideration the human element where, you know, if you pick up on the idiosyncrasies and the betting styles of the other players at the poker table, you can extract more money than you could if you just played optimally, right? As they say in the famous Paul Newman movie, Cool Hand Luke, right? Sometimes nothing can be a pretty cool hand, right? If you got the 4 and the 5 or whatever is like the worst hand of poker, you could still win the game, right? And I think that really goes to show you how, if anything, like poker is way more of an aesthetic experience than I think something like Go is, just because of all these extra elements. And if you know, the author is obsessed with this idea of mind melding into a game, which is to say you sort of lose yourself through the mechanics and you kind of just get into the aesthetics of the game. And I think because, you know, the way the poker is designed, it requires you to go into that mind meld. It requires you to kind of build a relationship with the other players at the table in a way that Go, as since it's a solved game, is never going to allow you to fully capture that experience. So yeah, I think the author is just off the rails here. I think his depiction of these two games is frankly silly. Moving on, something I really liked about this book is that, as I said before, Lantz is really passionate about talking about, you know, your immersion into the games. And we talked before about, you know, how I proposed this idea of poker being, you know, the real world game of poker versus the idealized game of poker. Frank Lantz loves this idea of the idealized version of games. He loves this idea of getting immersed into the games. And he goes into a bit of a lengthy, totally unnecessary description of this game, where he explains that, you know, in this game you had to make decisions. And long story short, he basically says, at some point I forgot about the buttons, and I just kind of felt like I was making those decisions intuitively, right? Just like at some point when we play the game Subway Surfers, right? We might forget about swiping left versus swiping right. We might truly feel like the Subway Surfer and truly feel like we're dodging the subway cars left and right. Okay, and I think there's other authors that have kind of explained this a bit better. I know there was one author, and he had this really great example where he was saying that, you know, when you're driving a car and somebody gets into an accident with your car, right, you don't say, oh, he hit my car. You say, he hit me. When you say that he's way too close to your car, right, because he's you know, driving really close behind your car, right, you say, you don't say, oh man, he's getting too close to my car. You say, he's riding my ass, right? Because you feel like the car is an extension of yourself. And that's ultimately what Frank Lantz is getting at here, though I don't think he does a great job of explaining it, but I totally vibed with him. I vibed with his experience of that aspect of the aestheticism of games. So yeah, right on. Totally agree with you there. And ultimately, I think that is the thesis of Frank Lantz's Beauty of Games. He's saying that the more that you can immerse yourself into the aesthetics of the game, into the true appreciation of the beauty of the game, appreciating art for art's sake, right? Tying it back to that Dark Souls quote, the more that you can truly go on these quests for achievement and advancement just for the sake of going on these quests for achievement of advancement, it's his belief that that is what defines, you know, the most beautiful games, and the game's aesthetic merit can be measured with respect to its goals along that front. All right, so that is a summary of this book. Ultimately, I think it does an okay job of defining what games are. It doesn't really do a good job of defining what beauty is, and it doesn't really do a great job of kind of combining the two and describing kind of how the beauty and the games sort of overlap. This game feels extremely, or sorry, this book feels extremely hand wavy. Okay, it's definitely a soapbox. You're basically reading this book to hear from this intelligent guy. What is his perspective? What does he think? But the book is devoid of, any sort of statistical merit. There's no real, um, you know, logic behind a lot of his reasoning. There's nothing like a statistic or something that you can lean on to kind of measure a lot of this stuff. It's very hand wavy. It's very opinionated, which I think has a lot of merit, especially if you align with this man and his perspectives on the world. If you agree with his artistic perspective, then you're going to really enjoy this book. And even if you don't quite agree, like for example, I didn't really agree with this author a lot. I still got a good amount out of it, and I still thought it was entertaining, and I appreciated hearing his thoughts. The book is somewhat random, okay? It's a little bit haphazard. He approaches the big questions of beauty in games from a lot of different angles, and it definitely comes across like a mess. The book needs an editor, like very deeply. It really needs an editorial pass to try and refine some of his arguments and to try and focus his arguments a little bit. If there was really something like a narrative through line, he dives a little bit into historical aspects of games, but that really doesn't go anywhere. If he could have done something like that, maybe a timeline would help. I'm not sure, or even just to kind of, if it was an emotional journey of like, okay, this is my experience exploring games. Here's a game I touched upon. Here's now my exploration with Go and how it relates to my previous exploration with poker. Maybe something like that could have helped guide the reader a little bit. But right now, it just kind of comes across like a hodgepodge. It's really messy, and it's hard to extract value from this book. Sometimes you say like you've got coal or something, right? And you got to mine it for diamonds. Right, it's hard. It's laborious, you might say, to mine this book for the gems inside there. It's tough, right? And maybe no more emblematic or representative of that is one of the final lines in this book, which I'm excited to read to you. There really isn't a very rewarding conclusion to this book. The main thesis ultimately ends in the following sentence, which I'll read to you now, and it's this somewhat unbelievable run-on sentence. He says, "Games will always operate in the nebulous realm of intersubjective judgment, fireworks lighting up the night between us, guided by evolving, recursive, unspecifiable criteria, never the global synchronization of a total authority, nor the global isolation of total relativism, but always the interference pattern generated by the intersection of the irreducible, truth of individual experience, and the undeniable reality of a shared world." Okay, so if you just heard that and you're thinking, what the fuck were you on about? What does that even mean? Then I don't blame you, because a lot of this book reads just like this sentence. The guy's got some great ideas, right? But he's not a very concise author. And it really just goes back to that point of he needs an editor to help refine the ideas here. Because I'm sure somewhere in that crazy sentence, there was a semblance of, I don't know, meat, right? Conversation here. But it just reads like a mishmash of buzzwords. And a lot of these chapters, a lot of the, paragraphs, they just read really vapid. And it's funny because the author, he says things like, hey, I'm gonna skip past this. I'm gonna use the word aesthetic because I don't want to waste time in getting lost in the sauce of whether or not what is art and whether or not it's an artistic medium, right? But then he totally goes ahead and wastes your time with so many buzzwords and this opaque rhetoric that totally undermines a lot of the work that he's trying to do here, and it waters down the book and it makes it at times just hard to read. With that being said, I got through it in a day. I read through the book pretty quickly, and yet, I thought, geez, This could have been a lot shorter. Definitely could have been a lot shorter. So I think that, you know what? It's hard to be clear. It's hard to be concise. But I think that the readership merits. I think the readership deserves a little bit more effort on that front. So that's my review. What do you think of the book? Have you had the chance to read it yourself? What do you think about these ideas proposed with respect to the artistic merit, or you might say the aesthetic merit of video games as a medium? Do you think games are art? Do you think the discussion is trite? It's overdone? It's boring? It's not worth having? Or do you have a strong opinion on the matter? Do you agree with Lantz here? Do you agree with me? Do you disagree? Let me know in the comment section. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you haven't checked out the book, you can check it out. It's published by MIT Press, and he's got a lot of unique perspectives on this thing. So you might just want to check it out and hear from somebody who clearly knows a lot about what it means to analyze games as an artistic medium. All right, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.